go. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming today. Taking time out of your busy schedule, middle of a work day to learn something new. Appreciate everyone taking time to do that. Obviously, everyone made it, who's here has made it on. You can see we have a new virtual event platform with Bevy. It's Cloud Native proper is moved over to that platform. So all the meetups are going to be transitioning over to that in the coming months or so. Hopefully it wasn't too difficult for people to get registered and get on here. If you have any if you have any comments on that or things to make it easier for other members who maybe weren't able to come this time, you can throw that in the general chat area of the meeting, or reach out to one of the organizers and just let us know what your experience was there. Next month's meeting will be held Thursday, June 3rd, same time, noon Central. We're still looking for a community member to give a talk on Flux. Again, I'll kind of reiterate what Kurt likes to say. You don't have to be, you don't have to be an expert in Flux, just willing to learn it and, teach what you learn. It's a good way to skill up yourselves and also sharpen your public speaking. So if you are willing to help out in that space, reach out to Brandon, Kurt, or myself, and we'll talk through that. Reminder, something fairly new: we're going to be giving away some swag packages for U.S. continental participants only. Sorry, Dennis. So we'll choose 3 random attendees from today's meeting, and we'll notify them directly once we have them chosen, and get your mailing address and get that stuff shipped out to you. But then we'll announce next time who this time's winners were, and we'll do that until we run out of stuff. This month in CNCF, so KubeNativeCon is going on right now. Cloud Native KubeCon Europe is going on this week from 4th through 7th. So there's still today, tomorrow. Tomorrow they may just be wrapping things up, but still maybe some time to catch up on the keynotes, or I believe all those keynotes you can watch after the fact. They're all recorded. Prometheus's launch is at KubeCon Europe. They announced that they're going to be launching a conformance program. So that's some guidelines as to be able to grade vendor products and how they integrate with Prometheus. So as you are considering bringing in a tool into your ecosystem, you'll be able to see if it plays nice with Prometheus, or how well it plays with Prometheus, if that is a monitoring tool that you're using in your organization to leverage metrics. So obviously Prometheus is graduated CNCF monitoring tool. So a lot of organizations are using that. Kubernetes is moving from quarterly releases to 3 times a year. They announced that as well. Might just something to be aware of if as you may change your cadence as you update if you are running Kubernetes and are managing the operation and upgrades of it. That's changing. They're changing their release cycle a little bit. Kubernetes 121 was released, I believe, beginning of first week April, or first week of April, just after our last meetup. So there's a plethora of new features out there. Go check it out. Cron Jobs are finally generally available now. They've been in beta since pretty much the inception of Kubernetes. So they're finally they're finally GA now. So not that affects too much, but for maybe organizations that are hesitant to take on resources that are in beta, those are available to you now. Another thing I thought was kind of interesting was an acquisition announced this week. Microsoft acquired Kinvolk, who does work in containerization. So there's an acquisition there. something to keep an eye on as far as I assume they're going to be helping out with their AKS offering and bringing some new and exciting things to Kubernetes in Microsoft. So we'll see what if that acquisition helps Microsoft better their offerings. That's all I had for an intro. Anybody who's attended one of our Cloud Native Madison talks in the past obviously knows Kurt. But if you don't, he's with a company called Styra. He's been doing engineering for a long time. I don't want to insult him by putting an age joke here, but he's been doing it for a long time and doing it well. And he's got a lot of interesting side hobbies that he does with his, as he talks about his smart home automation. If that is passion of yours, talk to him. He's built temperature control things for his daughter's pet snake. He's done some other kind of cool stuff too. So, and today he's going to be talking about application authorization with Opa and Styra. He should know it because Styra is the company that brings Opa to the marketplace. So without further ado, here's Kurt. Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong button. I need to stop sharing instead of, there we go.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Yes, I've been programming for a long time, but still enjoy it. So I did post some links, and hopefully they come out good in the chat. So this will be like a play along, if you so choose, as we go through some of our samples. This is a continuation. Shouldn't say a continuation, but another version of the talk that I did a couple of months back with the authorization. The last one was on the emission control side of things, of tying Opa into that. Whereas this is now around application authorization. It is something that I a lot of times misspoke, and I'll probably misspeak throughout this when I start calling it microservice authorization. It certainly can be used for microservices, but there's nothing preventing you from using the same type of practices with more monolithic type services as well. Steve mentioned all this before, but yeah, I've been doing engineering for a few years, and since the early part of the year, I've switched over to be a solution architect at Styra. I'm getting better at Opa. I'm still not going to call myself a foremost expert on it, but I certainly work with the whole crew of them. So what we're going to talk about today then is that application authorization, decoupling that policy from your business code. We're going to do a quick review of Opa. We won't get too far into depth. If you want that, a little more of that, I spent a little more time on that talk a couple of months ago, which you can see in our YouTube channel for Cloud Native Madison, or there's plenty of good resources on there. But I will do a quick review of that. I'll reinforce those roles that both what Opa plays in this, and we'll be using Envoy. Envoy isn't a requirement for this, but it does make it easier for us to bring these things together. And we'll see why as we get a little further into it. I'll give an explanation of why we want to have that decoupled policy from our business code. Give some examples there. And then we'll get into a little diagram of what we're going to be doing. And then, like I say, cross your fingers, be a live demo. And again, that first link out in that chat is, sort of that existing application that we have. And you might be somewhat familiar with it. It's similar to the one that we did last year when we talked about gRPC. So just getting right into it, what is Opa? Opa is a general purpose policy engine. It's trying to get you to think of policy as code. So it's a policy as code solution, but that's all it does. It does the decisions. It's very efficient at it. It'll be able to bring data sources in those policy files as data. and utilize that along with, whatever metadata comes along from, whatever your enforcement point is. But again, OPA itself is not that enforcement point. It's making the decisions, and it works with other technologies to actually do the enforcement. So it can be used in a wide variety of use cases because of that. It's a very simple REST API to utilize it, and that policy language then stays the same within that. And that policy language is Rego, is what's utilized. And we'll see a bunch of Rego today as we go through the demonstration here. In short, Rego is a declarative. Basically, you sort of put out there what you want your artifact or your JSON to look like, and it tests against that to say whether it's good or not. It's designed to work with those structured documents that we're all familiar with JSON in particular. It's pretty easy to read and write. It does, there's a little different mindset as you first get into it when you're coming from a general purpose language into this, but after you get used to it, it's very intuitive to write these tests in that. And it is actual code. We do want to treat it as code. We want tests written against it, and Rego allows for that. We want it to be checked into our source code so we can see those changes with it. And that's all part of being a as code solution for policy. This is, again, I stole this from the last talk that I did with this, but it reinforces that point of where OPA fits into it, where that Rego policy and that bundled data come together in that black box there on the bottom. Typically, we send that to OPA in what's called a bundle into that. And then that top, what's labeled service here, is that enforcement point. And as you can see on the right, there's many enforcement points, and this is not an exclusive list by any means. Envoy, your application directly, a CI/CD pipeline, Kubernetes and mission control, many different enforcement points OPA can work with, because it is a very general purpose, like that simple REST interface in and out of there. With that, especially when we're talking about our Envoy use case, and if we get into truly microservice authorization, where you may have hundreds, of these OPAs around, we have to manage them somehow. And I'll show you a technique today, and I'll talk about some other techniques that I would suggest more so than what I'd be even doing today. So again, another way to think about that is that OPA is that mob boss. It's making decisions, but it's not really doing anything. It uses an assassin, and our assassin for today is Envoy that we're going to be utilizing. And specifically within Envoy is set up, and there's a lot of different plugins and filters that you can put into Envoy, and we're going to be specifically working with the external authorization filter with that. I put a link out to this here, but it's purpose built for tasks like this, where you can offload that authorization that comes through the Envoy proxy, go to a third party before you come to your actual application service. But we've talked a lot about policy as code already, and that some of you are thinking it's like, hey, I already write my policy as code right now. I do it all the time. I have a method like this. I have this cool little framework here that does sort of a has role, so I know the roles that are coming in here. I can get that authorization header, and I got this other framework here that decodes that JWT for me and gets my claims. I call out using that and getting some of these accounts, and then I can check there then in this in an if statement. I can say, hey, if it's a claims manager and these accounts are part of my accounts, then it's okay. Else, if you're an admin, I can do it like that. Any other case, I'm going to throw sort of a forbidden on that. But I'm already doing this, right? this is code, and I wouldn't argue with that, right? This is code. This happens to be some Java code. I can't argue that it's code. Is it really policy as code though, or is it policy in code? Yeah, I think a lot of times, when we start talking about as something, we very much talk about things being separated and decoupled from that, and there's good reasons for that. So yeah, so you have this code in here like this, but how many frameworks do you use? So if this is maybe a homegrown framework that has role, so now you have logic in that framework for that. In a Java shop, I know you'll probably use a handful of frameworks there. So do you have a handful of other libraries, to work with those other frameworks, for that policy code as well? If you have other languages, you probably have frameworks around that to do all these things. And then so you're multiplying your effort by the number of frameworks that you have to account for in all of this. In any sort of bugs that you would have in there, are bugs that you might have to fix in multiple frameworks or have different bugs in different frameworks. And then even with this, how do you test this method here? You probably have to write a good, 5, 6, 7, 8 tests to go along and test all your conditions because now you have that grouped together. And now even worse, now let's say you had a regional manager that you want to have access to this, to this method here. So now you're going to come back into this code and you're going to add another, condition in an if statement. So now as you're reading through this, you're not really sure how many different, policies that you have built into this code. How many cases do I actually cover with this as I just keep adding to an if statement, maybe grabbing some other data from other areas. So yes, you do have policy in your code here, but it's in your code, not as your code. So the alternative to that would be, something like this. So now your business method is tied down to that one business thing that you wanted to do. You had code in there and annotations, that covered all those cases. But ultimately, the business logic in that method that you had was I just want the sum of those invoices. Now I can look at this, totally understand what that method does, and it becomes very easy to test, with that as well. Now with that though, I do have an addition now of some Rego, and we start to see some of the Rego code here as well. So we have some of that Rego code now that we have to bring along with that. Again, externalized from our business logic, but it's also now very clear as to what the intent is. And I can look at this right now and I know now that I have 2 cases that I'm supporting to come through this code. So it's very clear is my separation with that. In each one of those cases, they had a little different logic for that, right? So just like before, we'll let our admin, get to that no matter what. But if you're that claims manager, you have to be one of those, it has to be part of one of those accounts there. And so you can see the clear cases that allow for that policy into that with code like this. So ultimately, separating that business code from that policy code makes things easier to read and to update. And now I can even test each of these policies a little separately as well. So my test cases don't explode by the number of conditions that go back and forth. So overall, this is the biggest reason. This is why I'm so excited for this. Now you get rid of potentially having to support multiple other frameworks. Now it's easier to bring in new frameworks into a language or new languages into your environment because you don't have to make all these bindings to go along with it. So this is the case that really excites me a lot about the policy as code. I think what we talked about a couple of months ago with the emission control is a little more around like the compliance side of things of, that, but this is really helping engineers develop faster as they pull this stuff away. Our typical reference setup, which we normally like to set up when we start doing this, is to go through like an Envoy proxy. So we put an Envoy proxy in between either an existing service or a new service And it would be very common if you already had a service mesh. You already have a proxy in there, and most of the service meshes are Envoy based already. So you probably already have an Envoy proxy there. Now, this isn't the only way to do it. Like I mentioned before, there's certainly other ways to tie this in. And ultimately, you can call this policy code directly from your service. And there's use cases that makes sense as well. But as much as we can offload to that, to me, the better, because now I can use more primitive type features within my language, and I don't have to worry about external things. That Envoy filter will, like I already mentioned, I call out to Opa. And generally, Opa is controlled by a control plane, again, to manage the masses of Opas that we have there to get policies, do them efficiently. Not what we're going to be using today in our example, but it is something that would be recommended. The other way to get policies distributed would be to use a bundle service, or the way we're going to do it today is we're going to use just some config maps to make it nice and simple. So this is going to be our application that we'll be working with today. It's an existing running application. Maybe you've already been playing with it since I've been talking. What we're going to do, this is how it sits right now. It's just a couple of services in the background, a React app out front. We're going to be adding some sidecars into that right now. One for Envoy, one for Opa, and we do like to run these as sidecars, keep them all nice and tight together. And like I mentioned, we'll be using the config maps. We would normally use config maps to manage the configuration of Opa and Envoy, but we're also going to use it to bring in the data in the policy Rego files as well. So without further ado, let's see if this will break. And I have a high expectation today that we will break some things with this, because this is not a well-tested application. And I do see that there are some people in there already. And just to let you know what's going on with this a little, it's a very simple React application. If you click on your name or your roles, and these are your roles up here right now, you can actually set your own JWT token. So it's highly secure in that manner. Every time you refresh the screen, it's going to generate a new name for you. And it's also going to give you back the viewer and chatter roles. So if you start playing around with the different roles. As of right now, you can do anything you want with this. If you send a message out to everybody, which means you just have, just like I did there, it's going to come in red, or it does let you do a little specific message to someone. I have no idea who I just sent that to, but it went to them. So this is our basic application right now. It is running, as I said, with a couple of microservices as far as the users and messages. Ignore the decisions up here for now because that I couldn't quite get that working, for this example today. And then, of course, the UI out there on the right side top here. Hopefully, this is visible for everybody to be able to read. On the right side here, I'm just doing watching a curl command into the messages service and looking at the headers coming back there. And then, so we'll jump into the configuration code first. So this is our config maps now for the Opa in the Envoy sidecars. So just a standard config map, and the Opa configuration for this is relatively small because, again, I'm not tying to any external services for this. All I'm doing here is enabling that the Envoy extension, and I'll show you, when we get to actual sidecar definition, there is a different Opa container to pull in for that to get that plugin. We're just enabling it here and saying that we're exposing that gRPC endpoint as a import 9191, and then our default decision rule, which will come into play as we look at policy, that path and that default decision rule. So we'll look at that. So nothing really earth-shattering in there. Now, if anybody's familiar with Envoy configurations, they are always a fun and a joy to work through. And so this is our Envoy configuration. It's mostly standard as far as, what you would see in here for your pathing. If you're familiar with this, this would look familiar to you. The core is obviously familiar. But then we get to our external authorization. So this is the filter that we were talking about here. It is that type of the external authorization. And the configuration points on here, this first configuration point, failure mode allow, is if for whatever reason Opa wasn't there, do we want to just let all traffic through, or do we want to deny all traffic? So it's just a true false for that. If we're getting the request body, in this case, I did configure it to parse that. Will we allow the partial message of that? And then, I have that limited to a meg there, so it's not going to, overwhelm memory if a post is done with more than that. And then we are using a gRPC service here, so the Opa plugin for that, does support the gRPC, where normally you use the REST-based APIs for that, and you can configure the Envoy extension here to use the HTTP. But if you can use gRPC, why not? Because it's most of the time more efficient. So just that configuration for that, and that's the only real unique configuration that we have for that. And I've already applied these config maps into the cluster, so those are there. So now it's the actual. I didn't have one of my resources opened up here, so I will get into the services here as well. To show us what we're going to do for those sidecars. And so our sidecar configuration, I'll just look at, they're both the message and the user ones are going to look the same. So we have our normal container in here. This is listed on port 80. I'm cheating and just calling that I don't have a separate readiness or liveness probe there. And I am exposing all 3 ports here. You wouldn't normally have to. One, I'm fighting with the Google load balancer, so I had to open at least 2. And then I keep that Opa one open, just so I can test locally. But you wouldn't normally have to have those all open. Our Envoy config, again, it's a very standard Envoy. We pass in Envoy, pass in the config, and we're mounting that map, that config map into that config directory, so we have that file here locally. And then the Opa config, a couple things here. So again, it's our standard server run command that we would get. Even if we were working locally, we'd probably use something like this. We have our mounted config file, but we also now are mounting that policy file, to which I spoke of before. It's going to be both policy and data of what I'm utilizing in there. And so we can see that the volumes are there. So again, I have all this code. There are the links in the presentation. I have these code repositories opened up so you can view them. Now I don't have them well documented yet because I was running out of little time, but you'll be able to see those as well. So you don't have to totally understand all the detail as of right now. But right now, let's go ahead and apply those sidecars into it. So right now we can see our services are running just with the single container into it. But if I go ahead and apply our Opa configuration into that, within a couple of seconds, those things will restart. And now anybody that was chatting out there, it also clears out all the messages whenever I restart these, because I'm not using any sort of persistence up at that level. So it's just being held in memory, all those messages. So you'll have to type in there again. But when you try to do that, you're likely, just like you see on the right here, you're probably going to get a 403 at this case, because the policy that I actually put into this is, and let's go look at it over into a different view here. Our policy, and these are also links that I gave you. So I gave you 3 links to the Lego Playground for different steps that we'll be going through this. Our policy is a default allow false. So we're not going to let any traffic into it at this point, except for the Google load balancer, else those services wouldn't show up as running at all. Oops, I got ahead of myself. so just a little walkthrough of what this this policy is. Remember when we looked at the configuration for the for Opa, and we had that default rule of rules main, and so that's what we're referring to here. So we have our package of rules, and our main rule here is main. And again, this is and then Envoy within that expects to see a property called allowed, and if whether that's true or false is whether Envoy is going to let that pass through. So within the Roekle playground here, if you've never played with the Roekle playground, you can execute the code, and if you highlight just one of these rules, you can just highlight that and run that. And you can see we would get an allowed false here. We're also getting these headers through there. We'll probably talk about that. Well, I know we'll talk about that a little more later. But just quickly, that is coming through this rule here. So this, even though we have a default rule in here, it's actually utilizing this rule right now, and we actually default allow false here as well. But we're bringing through this headers property, and in this case, we're saying if you were not allowing it, then I want to place a header named message with no access friend as the message into that. And that's what we're seeing here. And that's so when we look back at our application, we can see that we don't actually have access to view any of this through here. So that's just a little helper. And, so my application was previously set up to, on a 403, look for that header. So if you have the application set up like that already, again, there was no changes that I needed to do to that front end application to utilize that header because it was something that I was doing previously on a 403. I, of course, say that theoretically because I made this application for this specific purpose. But obviously, we want to allow more than that. So to create an allow rule, and as I probably didn't explain enough this time, but I explained it in the last meeting that we had, is these allow rules are basically or conditions. Anything within inside the brackets here is an and condition. So when you compare this to like a general purpose language, think of these rules as a big if statement. All the conditions within this are anded together. And if you have multiple rules with the same name, those are or conditions. So now I want to make another or condition for this. And I'm going to make a fairly simple one at this point. And I do have these helper rules down here that are dealing with my token. So I'm grabbing the token out of a standard spot, which Envoy will give us this path for. And I'm just grabbing the token part of it. So I'm getting rid of the bearer there. And now I do have methods in here to decode that token. And I'm actually decoding and validating at the same time. And I've got those secrets here. Any valid secrets for that token is here in this data section as well. So I can use this rule within here. So I'm going to look at that token payload. Now, I'm not exactly sure, although I am exactly sure, but I'm not exactly sure what's in there. So I'll use the editor here, and I'll actually just look at that token payload, and I can see what all my claims are in there. And I'm interested right now in the roles. So I want to look at roles, and I know it's an array, so I can look at any of this. So just as I do something like this, it's just saying I'm going to iterate through all these values within this array. And I want one that's, if it's equal admin, now that's all I want, because I want my admins to be able to do anything. So now with an allow for the admin, now if we rerun this main rule here, now we see we have an allowed true, and we no longer have that header because we said we only want that header on a not allow. So this is, more or less a policy that I would want in there. So with that, then let's go ahead and apply that policy into our cluster. And so that's our second version of the policy. The first one just didn't have any of that. And right now, I will have to restart the pod so it picks up those config maps. And it'll take a second or two here. It'll restart. And as it's restarting here, if we look at the application, ultimately that'll start, and we will see that now I do have access to that again, and I'll probably have to refresh here again just to get connected back to the user side of things. And then we have people saying hello, and I'll say hi back to everyone. And this all works good at this point in time. So now we have access again. Now, of course, if I, I did in that other policy there, I do have rules in there that I've also coded up for the viewer and chatter. But of course, if I take all of those away, it would take access away from myself again, and I still have no access. So now this is, that role-based, from this level here. Again, I haven't made any changes to any of my server side or my application side at this point to get any of this work with Opa in between. So let's take a little look at like the next set of policies here and before. So this is the one that we just coded up and applied, and these are some of the other policies that I just applied along with it. So with our viewer role, and I create a function for that now because I know I'm going to be using that has role. So we can see this has role function down here. So I'm passing in, hey, does it have that role of viewer? And then it does the same type of logic that we saw up here when we coded in the admin. So it's just a little convenience function at that point in time. Now I'm checking for, the get method in parsed path. So I'll stop at this point a second to actually look at the input. So this is the input that you would typically get from Envoy. So the Envoy, the filter there does give us a very specific input document, which is nice. So now we know what to expect as far as bringing this stuff through. So we can see here, it gives us attributes, request, HTTP headers, and it breaks out the method even outside of the header here as well. And so that's where you see I'm getting it here, just HTTP method. So we can see all this stuff that comes through here. And this is an actual request here that I gave for you. So you can play with this, play with these rules, play around with it, see what you can do with it. But it also, parses out, if there was a body to this, it would parse out the body. It would parse out, the path obviously is what we're using for a lot of these. And if there's query parameters, it'll parse those out, with the name and then the value of those as well here. And then, like I mentioned before, if we do bring the body through and it truncates it, it'll tell us that it truncated it. So it gives us a lot of information to make a lot of good policy decisions off of. And so that's what we're utilizing here. So we're making sure that, hey, this is a GET request. Our path is messages. And in this case, we want to make sure that, you're calling for your own person. So again, we're decoding that token and then getting the subject of that and making sure that matches the subject that's being called into that as well. So if that matches and you're a viewer, you can see your own data, but you can't see anybody else's, or I shouldn't even say data at that point, but messages that were set up for them. And then we keep going through it. We have the put for the users. Again, that's a little more simple. We're just making sure that path both matches the users. And again, using the subject off of that token, you can only update your own at this point. And then, a couple of other ones, allows here as well. Again, remember, these are all OR conditions at this point in time. But now you say that, okay, I see how we can protect our endpoints with that, but I want the UI to change as well. So when I have policy and I give, maybe these menu items here, although this menu item doesn't do much, if I go back and forth, I display different menu items based on what, what policies, that person has access to. And so the way I set up the application is to bring that, the service would let the UI know what attributes that it could display in those menu items there as well. So our next set of policies that we'll write here, and now I think I'm probably using the term policy a little loosely, but at the same time, it is going off of who you are and what you have access to. But now I'm going to use another header here, and I'm going to call that T-links, and I'll tell you in a bit why I do that. But I'm also using these other rules here to compose the larger item here. So ultimately with this, I'll get an array, although in this case, I'm only ever going to get one of these because it's just doing a modulus off of my subject. And all of our subjects are numeric, and they all started at 1,000 and going up. So, just whether you're even or the odd is all that's there. And then it's going to return this header back. So I can apply this policy at this point. And I'm on version 3, I keep myself. But it won't actually do anything because now this, if we think about how this is interacting, these headers are going to the destination of the service. And so in this case, we're working with an allow at this point in time. So we're being allowed into the application. And so I'm passing this header. So this header is actually going to my backend service, not back out through, to the UI. So here's where I do have to start modifying the application a little to accommodate for this. And so here is my version 1 of that get messages. And it was very simple. Again, this is where we're passing in and using that subject there. But it's not doing much of anything else. But my V2 of this will now look at that. It'll bring in this header parameter, and all it does is it turns around and it sets it into a links header and sends it back to the UI. So again, the service itself isn't knowing about that information, but it's passing that along back to the UI. Now, this is one way to do it, to pass it in from the header initially with Envoy. Another very common, probably even more common way is to make a call into Opa from here to get those as well. But even whichever way you get that information, you'd still pass it back in either a header or some data section, back to your UI. So now if I apply my V2 of my message service here, and eventually that will restart itself. But when we come back into the application, then now I'm apparently an even number. And you can see if you're even or odd. I do have the identifier up on the top of this JWT. So now it tells me that I'm not odd. So I imagine half of you out there are odd. The other half are not odd. Of course, I might say we're probably more all odd than not odd, but that's okay. So again, that's a way to get some of that policy results back to the UI. And again, it's very low overhead. It's very straightforward to pass some of that back through there. But now you're going to go one step further and say, hey, yeah, that's all great. I have that policy that, I utilize in the UI to drive my UI, but I also have policy that affects, that data that I want to see back, that result data coming back. The most common use case would be, I'm limited to see these number of, or, these IDs, if I'm working with companies, I can only look at these companies. Now, you could, pass that into the Rego engine and let it filter that down for you. That's generally not going to be an efficient way of doing that. Most likely, you want to take those, whatever you have access to, and you want to pass that down to your database. Your database engines are very efficient at limiting down like that. So we want a mechanism to do that. And so going to use the same type of setup that we did before with the links, and I'm going to pass this to xallowed subject header. So now my intention of this is just for that backend service to utilize. Again, I'm using the even and odd thing here, but I'm using data as well, because again, our policies can have data associated with them. And so in this case, I didn't want to give everybody individual data for all of this, so then I'm just going to tell if you're even or odd and go off of that. And so now I'm going to limit, if you're even, I'm going to limit, what you can see down to these even numbers. And as you might imagine, if you are odd, there'll be a list of odd numbers here that you'll be limited to. So now if we would run this again, now we see we have another header here that has our list of subjects, bar separated at this point in time. So again, I can apply this policy. I'm on V4 of the policy. I have to get my, I didn't number these quite the same back and forth. And then again, we do have to do a little change to our application. So my next version of the application here will take, now they'll take that other header parameter here, so that allowed subjects, it'll actually do some filtering here based on that. So now you're going to say, hey, now I got this policy logic in my code again. And I'd argue that you don't have the logic for that policy into the code, but you're letting something else know that there was policy. So now I can still change that policy outside of this code. That list of IDs that are coming back can be vastly different. All the code knows about is that there could be a list coming in, and if so, I'm going to pass it on and filter that down. In this case, just using a stream filter. A normal case, I think you'd see this passed into some sort of database, like an end clause or something like that, to limit that data down to that. So with that, I can now, and again, we're going to clear out all the message data at this point in time. And the other thing that went off of is it did go off of that filtered role within the UI. So as people, as this comes back up here, and we look at it, and if people start chatting here again, in order to see some of these things go away, you'll have to come in here and hit that filtered role within that. And then, of course, I don't know if anybody else was chatting in there at all. But so that would filter them out, based off of this. So it's another way that now your policy can be utilized, by your application, but not, part of that application, not embedded within that. We still have the policy outside of that application, but the application can be, at least it can pass that along to other areas to utilize. So those were the changes for the application and everything. Now the important part of, one of the really important parts, and this is where I put that message earlier on, and I did forget to talk about it a little, is that auditability. When we come back to this code here, the other problem with this code is just how auditable is this, right? So I have compliance or somebody else coming and asking me, hey, who did what when? Okay, so I can do that, but now I'm going to be adding more code into here to tell you who did what when at that point in time. And that's another thing where Opa is set up in terms of being able to push those decisions back to a central location. And like I said, I didn't quite get that working in the application, although I tried, but just ran out of time. But I am going to cheat here a little. And I'll have to say I cheated a lot during this whole time and used our commercial product to look at a lot of this. But this, regardless if it's in the commercial product or not, this is what your decision is going to look like. So your decision comes back in this case, and we just see a general allowed true up here. But we also see the entire input document. So that same input that we were looking at within the playground, we see here as well. So part of that decision, we get that whole input. We get some, if we pass labels through to things, we'll see those labels come back through. We'll see metrics on how long it took to evaluate this decision. And you notice we measure things in nanoseconds because policy evaluation is quick. But most importantly, we see this result object here. So we can see that these are allowed. And then within our tool here, these are all color coded between green and blue. So to me, it's very important because that's a huge aspect of having a system like Opa, as part of your overall architecture, is now you can ship these decisions back. Even more cool when you use a product like this, you can use this to help you code up your next one as well. So I can take this and I can load this up into the policy and I can execute it from in here and see what my output is, based off of this previous decision or whatnot. And I can edit in here. And then when I publish these, it would be published out there, within about 10 seconds, that Opa would pick it up. So it gives you some more benefits, but ultimately what I really wanted to show you here is that, the decision itself and how it is you get this, all this great information coming back from that as well. So with that, that's all I had, and I haven't been able to look at the questions, but are there any questions?
The questions that were there there wasn't too many questions, but they were answered fine in the chat.
Cool. Well, I hope everybody found this valuable today. It's another aspect of again, doing that decoupling with your policy, and it's more of a journey in all these areas that you can find to actually decouple this policy. So to me, it's a very exciting. Maybe a little biased, and I'll admit that now because I work for the company around Opa, but at the same time, from my engineer hat, being able to take that method and get that policy code out of there and to really deal with the business logic is very powerful.
Yeah, one question for you, Kurt. What do you see as far as either open source or kind of like enterprise commercial users of Opa doing in terms of potentially like collecting the metadata around those decisions? Do you see a lot of use cases out there where people are pumping that into Splunk or their log aggregators or analytics or anything else like that for troubleshooting purposes?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for troubleshooting purposes, and that's where it's nice to have a control plane. And no, there's a lot of organizations because the management APIs around Opa are part of Opa. So there's organizations that'll make their own management plane, but be able to bring that stuff back, use it for debugging, like you say. I think especially even more so when you get over into the emission control, there's more of a compliance need to save those decisions along with that. Even a lot of the APIs, I mean, you get into more and more into that. If you get into healthcare and insurance and stuff like that, there'll be more of a compliance need to save that. So yeah, so we do see them saving that off, whether it's into, because you can pump those, into a S3 bucket or something like that and just, save them, archive them, to whenever you need them, have your retention policies set up on that. And go with that. And that is, a common way to take in those logs. But again, it's a very powerful being able to get those logs, quite easily, when you use, externalize that policy.
Sort of a related question, but since you're obviously working with customers who deal with Opa, do you ever, is it usually the case that the team implementing the actual services and the business logic are always kind of owning, the actual policy definitions, or are you seeing any, folks out in the industry where they kind of like split those, where you'd have like a separate group that can kind of like own the policy out of band so that like the engineers, it's kind of like out of their hands?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a desire around that, and a lot of the desire is around, not even necessarily off team, but maybe having like that BA person, on the team be able to do some of that. And I personally think Rego is easy enough for most anybody to learn and understand to do that. Although I do think we'll see some more visual tools, maybe that will generate a little more Rego as well to offload some of that as well. But yeah, that is common to have that, you know, being separated in that realm as well. Oh, I didn't throw up the last slide, but you know, as far as the, you know, I'll throw the slide deck out on there, but I do have the links for everything that we did here today, and I do have some links to, you know, some of the well, the version of DAS and DAS was our commercial product that I showed you there. There is a free version of that anybody can sign up for, and you can utilize that against a local Opa on your machine if you want, or a cluster that you have or whatever. You know, there's obviously some limitations in there, but it's great to learn and utilize like that. You know, so I'll have a link for that out in there, but then a link to other documentation around the Envoy Opa, you know, integration and whatnot as well. So I'll throw that out on the Meet site.
Great. We thank everybody for coming, and happy to announce that I got a ping from somebody who's interested in presenting on Flux next month from the community here. So, and yeah, hope to see you on the first Thursday of next month. Thanks, everybody.
That was great. Bye.